Welcome back to the Traditionalist channel, people. And today we'll be talking about lecture number 14, Mill on Liberty and Utility. Utilitarianism was invented by Jeremy Bentham and James Mill, who adapted notions from the 18th century Scottish tradition, particularly utility or social benefit and the ideas of sympathy. As a philosopher of law, Bentham was critical of the British tradition of common law precedents. He wanted a modern scientific reform of the law. He rejected the social contract theory as a fiction and the notion of natural rights as nonsense. The criterion that ought to be used to evaluate a proposed law was generally utility. Actual anticipated social benefit understood as the quantity of happiness or pleasure that would likely result from adopting the statute. Mill's hierarchy of pleasure. Like Benjamin and his father, John Stuart Mill, takes an inductive and empirical approach to ethics. We can determine what is right or good only by observing what people actually do. Reason devoid of observation cannot determine the moral good. Happiness or pleasure, as the ancient Greek Epicurus said, is the ultimate good. We know this because it is what all people actually value as the highest good. An act is right insofar as it is likely to increase pleasure or happiness. Thus, it is the consequence of an act that makes it right. That is, what we value and praise in the acts of others, not mere good intentions, but the production of good effects. The ultimate moral rule is, therefore, the greatest happiness principle, also called the principle of utility. Act so as to maximize general happiness. Each individual's happiness, including one's own, counts equally in the calculation as to what act maximizes happiness. The major difference between Mill and Bentham and James Mill was that Bentham, trying to turn ethics into a science, made differences between pleasures solely quantitative. Any pleasures you might experience could be equaled by a larger quantity of another pleasure. In principle, eating enough ice cream could equal the pleasure of writing a poem, falling in love, or being elected president. Mill rejected this. They are both quantitative and qualitative differences between pleasures arranged in a hierarchy. Humans have a variety of capacities for pleasure, and some are higher than others. How can Mill justify this hierarchy of pleasures? Because he says people in fact choose the higher quality pleasure once they have access to them and are familiar with them. This was also a social point. The poor, if they had access to higher culture, would want it. How do we apply this principle regarding any prospective moral or immoral act? We ask ourselves, what is the total set of people likely affected by it, and what is likely affected on each of them? We must add up all the increases and decreases of every different quality of pleasure for each affected person or class of person. Mill answers the charge that this would absurdly laboriously by saying that we have many secondary principles, moral rules all of us have been taught by society that are handy guides to what promotes general happiness, such as don't cheat, steal, or kill, and so on. Is lying wrong? Mill would answer that it generally is, because lying is usually done to satisfy some personal interest and harms others. But when doctors tell you that your grandmother has only a few days to live, and you fear that telling her the truth will make her unhappy, should you tell her? Perhaps not. There are external and internal sanctions for the principle, but the most important is an internal sanction, sympathy. All utilitarians believe that we are hardwired to feel with others. This can be overwritten by experience, but it can also be magnified and whitened by education. Problems with utilitarianism. There are two problems with utilitarianism. First, utilitarians after Mill distinguish two ways of understanding his principle of utility. They differ on what the utility is to be applied to. The simple theory is act utility. Whatever particular act maximizes happiness is right. But when Mill mentions secondary principles, he opens the door to rule utility. Whatever rule of action maximizes happiness is right. If the question is, will lying to my dying grandmother maximize general happiness? The answer might be yes. But the answer also has to be yes to the question, will the rule don't lie maximize general happiness? That is, the general rule wipes out the extremes of utilitarianism. The second problem with utilitarianism is that it seems as if the philosophy would make it morally acceptable or even obligatory to harm a minority or an individual if doing so benefits the majority. For example, what if it would make the majority happier to expropriate the property of the rich or turn a minority into slaves? It seems as if utilitarianism could lead to violations of rights. A smart utilitarian can try to avoid this problem. Harming the minority might actually harm all society, including the majority, in the long run. Perhaps belief in individual rights will usually maximize general happiness. The harm principle. Like Tocqueville, Mill also feared the tyranny of the majority in democratic society. In a free society, what are the rightful limits on individual freedom? In his classic essay on liberty, Mill answered with the principle of liberty, since called the harm of principle. Society may infer with liberty of a member only for self-protection. One implication of this is that self-regarding actions cannot be sanctioned. Equivalently, paternalism, limiting an agent's liberty for the sake of liberty for the agent's sake, is prohibited. To limit an agent's liberty, it must be shown that his or her liberty is likely to harm others. Mill gives arguments for this in applying it to, on the one hand, liberty of taste, pursuits, and association, and on the other hand, liberty of consequences, sentiments, and expressions of our opinion. First, though, and thought and discussion can never be restricted. Mill's argument goes like this. Imagine a minority opinion hated by the majority. Now imagine that the minority is right. Should their expression be sanctioned? No, because the truth improves society. But suppose the minority is wrong. Mill argues that even then, their expression of the wrong view is an improvement to society. By encouraging the correct majority to refine its understanding, the conflict of ideas improves the discussion. Even Christian morals, as put forward in the New Testament, are not complete. Mill writes, and must be debated in order to be expanded and applied to new situations. For more or less the first time in Western history, social diversity of opinion is claimed as a good. Mill accepts that the free development of individuality is the most important work of man. The realm of states, pursuits, and association is more difficult because here an individual's actions may have a direct effect on others. To interpret it, we need to see how Mill applied it. The precise formulation by Mill is that society can interfere with individual liberty only when it threatens direct harm to definite others. Further, the harm must be violation of a moral norm, not merely constructive harm. Mill also says that if the harm is to someone's rights, such as theft, the proper sanction is illegal. If the harm is to someone's interest, for example, your neighbors is surly, the proper sanction is social disappropriation. Mill outlaws paternalism, but people often claim that society is harmed by, for example, pornography or offensive speech. If that were true, then Mill's principle would have to permit the sanctioning of such behavior. But Mill rightly says that would be an unfair and unreasonable application of this principle. We cannot accept the claim that immoral behavior harms society in general, such as interpreting would make liberty impossible. For example, if a Muslim society can argue legitimately that someone eating pork in private is harming society, then nothing we do can ever be considered self-regarding and immune to prohibition. Thus, drinking, smoking, gambling, and fornication cannot be punished, either by law or public opinion. And, as we saw, all matter of public opinion, speech, or unorthodox thought cannot be sanctioned because it does no real harm. But private acts performed in public can be prohibited because such acts, in effect, close the public realm to others. Mills and socialism. You may notice an apparent contradiction between Mill's utilitarianism and his liberalism. Sometimes the happiness of the majority might be increased by limiting the liberty of the minorities or individuals. Mill's response is simple and empirical. He is conceived that the society that allows the most experiments of individual freedom will yield the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Utilitarianism supports the principle of liberty. Mill's commitments fed into neoliberalism and libertarianism. The harm principle and the reaction of paternalism, the love of individuality, and the fear of conformity are libertarian, that is, heartily believed by people who want minimal government, the lowest possible taxes, and maximum individual liberty. But then in his autobiography, Mill wrote that as his beliefs have evolved, he could be classified under the general designation of socialist. This is reflected in the latter editions of his Principles of Political Economy. How can Mill be a socialist and a proto-libertarian? The clarification comes in an unfinished work titled Chapters on Socialism, published after his death by his stepdaughter. Mill had always been upset that English life was dominated by bequests or inherited wealth, which he thought unjust. He argued that property rights were historically highly variable and should be decided by social utility. He believed that the problem of production had been solved by the market economy, but not the problem of distribution, and government action was necessary for the redistribution, especially in education and old age pensions. He was not a modern libertarian. Still, he utterly rejected state-centralized socialism as an economic chimera. Production requires a division of labor. Competition and differential wages or rewards are just as necessary as incentives. Taking away the capitalist profit or return on interest would do little for the worker and would destroy production. He continued to argue against state paternalism, but he was open to local experiments in what some have called industrial democracy. For Mill, socialism meant local workers' co-ops, worker management cooperation, and some of what we will later call progressive or new liberal social legislation, and he emphasized its experimental empirical character, whose outcomes would have to be judged over time. He claimed that the revolutionary socialism would be a disaster for all. Alright guys, so I really hope you like this video. Hit the like button, share, and let me know in the comment section what you thought of this lecture on Mill and utilitarianism plus socialism.